Hi everyone, my name is Zach and welcome to part 2 of my large-scale fake background forest in Blender tutorial. In the last video I showed you how to render and set up an alpha plane tree that is interacting with the sunlight. In this video I show you how to get rid of this flat shadow and how to set up a particle system so that we have our final forest. Without further words, let's get started. Alright, now we have still one problem left. When I'm rotating the sun to the side, you can see the shadow is really flat. Certainly because there's no geometry, and this we will adjust in a second. Also, if I'm moving the camera here, we never want to see the trees from the side. That means the trees should always look to the camera. And for that, I enable the layer with the camera. Then I select one of the trees. Let's delete the other two. This one here. Go to constraints, and here we choose the track 2 constraint, and as target we choose the camera. Now you can see this object is pointing to the camera, but the rotation is wrong. So let's see. It should be X direction, and also we should check in edit mode if the normal is pointing in the right direction. So press N and here enable the normal, and then you can see it should point to the camera. This is right. If this is wrong, you simply have to invert the axis, so choose the other axis. And certainly the tree should not move like this. It should only rotate in the Z-axis. So I select this tree, add a limit rotation constraint and limit X and Y. And now you can see if I'm moving the camera, it's always pointing to the camera. That means if I'm in the camera and moving around, you can see the tree is always looking in my direction. And for fixing the shadow problem, we duplicate our tree, call this tree shadow, and under object cycle setting I disable camera. That means we can see the interaction with the objects like the shadow, but we can't see the actual tree. And on this tree I also add a constraint. This two I delete. And here I add a simple copy rotation constraint, and here I choose the sun lamp. Certainly this should only copy the Z-axis. And you can see the rotation is not right at this moment, so I enable offset. Then I rotate this to the sun lamp, and now if I'm rotating, you can see we always have the full shadow. Currently we see the shadow on the tree itself, but we will fix this in a second using the render layers. But before we do that, we create a particle system. Alright, now we want to create the forest, but we don't only want to use one tree, so I take some trees I've created before, paste them here, and I delete the camera and the sun lamp, and now I set the target to our current camera and the sun. I do this pretty quick and we see us in a second. Alright, now we have a whole bunch of trees here, as you can see. I always have the tree itself, and always also a shadow version. And now all the trees are rotating with the sun and also moving with the camera, as you can see. So when you're using multiple trees, make sure that they are all standing at the same position. And we have to group all shadow trees and all standard trees. So I select all the standard trees, then I press Ctrl G. And down in the operator panel I can call this trees, and then I select all the shadow versions, Ctrl G, and this I call shadows. Then I select all the trees except the ground, move them to the second layer. The sun I move to the camera layer, and on the first layer I only have this plane. So right now we don't need the node editor, so let's collapse it. And on this plane we now will create the forest. So one little note, if we take a look at this tree here, you can see that the trunk is not in the center of this tree. And it's very important that you go to edit mode, and with local you can move this around. And if I enable the material shading, we can see the texture, and now you have to move the trunk in a way that it is exactly on the position of the center point of this object. And the same thing you need to do with the shadow. So, and this is important. When the shadow rotates, then the shadow is always connected with the trunk. And yeah, this is important, otherwise the shadow would move around and then there's no connection between the shadow and the actual tree anymore. Alright, just a side note, now let's create the particles. I select the plane, add a new particle system, this I call trees, set the type to hair, also enable advanced, and now under render we enable group, and under duplicate group we select the trees. Now for these trees we don't want random rotation or anything, so we go to rotation, enable this, and here we set this to none. But now you can see it's not doing what we want. We need to enable under render rotation. And now these trees are using the original rotation. So all the trees are looking in the direction of the camera. And also, as you can see, it's very important that they are not looking directly to the camera, but instead they are all in one line, and in this way no clipping can happen, that this tree is clipping through this tree. So if we are looking at this forest right now and do a quick render, we can see we have a bunch of trees. So now let's adjust the settings. First of all, under physics we can control the size and also control the random size, that some trees are bigger and others are smaller. Then under emission we can change the number of the trees. For my example scene I had in the beginning, I had 190,000 trees, and I also tried out a scene with about 1 million trees, and this works just fine. So let's do a quick render, and now you can see we have this forest and it got lit by the sun lamp. By the way, if you are using an HDRI map, you have to rotate the shadows by hand, or you find a way using drivers or anything to connect the rotation of the HDRI map with the rotation of the shadow map here. Alright, there's even more that you can do. For example, if I have a higher subdivision of this plane, I can go to the weight paint mode and just paint the areas the trees should grow on. Just for example, and then in the particle settings, under vertex group, I can select this group in the density field. And now you can see the trees are just growing on certain places. So as you can see right now, the sun is shining from the front and the shadow is just fine. In this case, you certainly don't need to add this special shadow tree. But yeah, if I'm rotating the sun lamp so that it shines from the side, you clearly can see that we have this very flat shadows. So now let's add a quick green color to the ground. Check this out. Not too dark. Let's choose a nice perspective. Right, also if we want to increase this, we can make this bigger and just add a few more trees, like 20,000. And we can see the camera is clipping right now, so I select the camera, go to the camera settings and increase the clipping. And let's move it down so that we don't see the ending of this plane too good. Now let's render this. And now you can see we have a lot of trees. Certainly the terrain is pretty boring in this case, but anyway, now let's set up the shadows. For that we have to duplicate the whole thing once, move it with M to another layer, and here we have to go to the particle settings, duplicate them, and let's call this shadows, and under render we choose this shadows group. And the great thing is right now they will stay perfectly in place. So if I enable both layers, you can see we have this cross everywhere. So if you change anything, you just have to keep the same settings on both particle systems. So let's call this ground shadow. And also, for example, if you're changing the seed or anything, simply do it for both particle systems, and then all the trees will perfectly align with the shadows. Also, for example, if you like to have more trees of a certain species in your forest, then you can go to the render and enable use count, and then you have the list of all your objects. And then, for example, I want more fir trees, so I increase this to 25, for example, 25. And then if I'm doing the same thing for my shadows, for A and B, set to 25. Now let's see. You can see this is just fitting perfect. Alright, now let's set up the render layers. So we need two render layers, one for the trees, one for the shadows. And now with this render layers, we want to set up the trees will be rendered separately from the ground with the shadow. And in this way, we don't have the shadows on the trees. So this ugly effect, let's show it once again. Yeah, you can see the shadows are nice now, but we have these shadows on the trees itself, and this doesn't really look good. And because of this, we're doing this whole render layer stuff. Also, I disable the particle systems for a second. Now let's add a very simple mountain. So I switch to sculpt mode, enable dynamic topology, and add some hills here. So from our camera perspective, then some trees are behind the mountains and so on. And this is important because this is a common thing if you are doing landscapes. And for this, we have to take care in the render layer settings. Now the ground of the shadows is different from the one of the trees. Now let's copy the geometry data to the shadow ground. Simply select the shadow ground, then the one with the hills, and then press Ctrl L, object data, and now both of them have the same terrain, as you can see. And now if you're changing one of them, the other one will change as well, because they are now linked together. So now we can enable the trees and the shadows. And as you can see, everything is fitting perfectly. Now let's select the ground with the trees, go to the particle settings, and here under render we disable emitter. That means the ground won't be rendered. Let's set this to smooth shading, but we want to render the emitter of the shadows. That means we have the ground with the shadows. Now let's adjust the render layers. For the trees, we want to render the first layer with the trees on it, and certainly the sunlight. So that means we enable these two layers, and we want that the shadow layer will be masked. That means the trees behind the hills will be cut off. And for this, we need to set this layer with the shadow ground to act as mask. And for that, we simply select the mask layer here. And as you maybe remember, the reason that we are doing this render layer settings here is that we don't want to have the shadow from the shadow trees on the trees which we will see in the end. And because of that, we need to exclude the layer with the shadow trees for the actual trees. That means this layer won't interact with the layers we have selected up here. Alright, that's it for the trees render layer. Now let's select the shadows. And here certainly we want to render this layer with the shadow trees on it and also the sunlight. But we don't mask anything because this is just the ground and the trees we will have on the other layer. Also, we don't exclude the trees layer because I want that the trees, the actual trees, also cast shadow, and in this way we have stronger shadows in the areas under the trees, and I noticed that this is looking much better than just having the shadows from the shadow render layer. That's it with the layer settings. Now let's go to passes, and here we enable mist. And the same thing for the trees. We enable mist, and then we can composite a nice mist effect so that we have a feel of distance in the image. You will see later. For that we need to do some settings. I press Shift, left click on this layer, then you can see I enabled this layer as well. And here I select the camera, and then I go to the camera settings. Under display I enable mist, and then we can see the area in which we will have the mist fall off, but certainly it's too small. And for changing this, I go to the world settings, and after you have enabled the mist path in the render layer tab, you have this mist path settings here. And here let's start at 10 something. You can see it starts where the tree starts, and the depths we put up to, let's say 100. This is looking good. Don't make it wider than the actual trees are, so that the trees in the background are covered in fog. Alright, that's the settings for render layers and mist. Now I've noticed a little problem. You can see if we are zoom in, a lot of trees are exactly at the same position. That means this causes some clipping and this will cause some render issues. And because of that, we have to change some particle settings. First of all, I disable the vertex group down here. And certainly you have to do it for both particle systems. And then the other important thing, we go to emission, and here is jittered enabled, and I enable random. Now you can see the trees are distributed much more randomly. Same thing for the other particle system. And the cool thing is, if you are changing, for example, the seed value, that you have another distribution of the trees and do it for both particle systems, you can see the trees and the shadows are still at the same position. So you can change this value as well. But yeah, we keep it at 0 for this rendering. And now let's change the render settings. We go to render settings. Certainly I want to render this with GPU. That's one of the reasons that we are doing the whole thing here. Then under dimensions, I set the resolution to 100%. I keep this at full HD. Then let's go to output. And here I keep PNG enabled and also RGBA for color with alpha channel. For this tutorial I keep the render samples at 128, so it's an okay value. It's not too high and not too low. Then let's go to light path. Here we disable reflective and refractive caustics. We don't need that. And the one important thing we have to change is the maximum transparency value. So let's render a small part here without the shadows enabled. And now let's decrease this value. And as you can see, if I put this to 0, then the light rays just pass through one layer of transparency, and everything behind this, if there's another layer with transparency, that means another tree, then this will only display it in black. And with this maximum bounces value, you can define how far the light rays should pass through layers of transparency. So if there are a lot of trees behind each other, you have to set this value pretty high. So especially in the more far away areas here, we have a lot of trees behind each other. So to go sure that this will work, we set this to 50, for example, then we will have this issue. So if you have some black spots in your image, then increase this value here. Also important, you have to check shadows for transparency. Otherwise, we just have these rectangular shadows of the plane and not from the alpha channel itself. Alright. And the last thing we have to do is under film enable transparent, so the background will be rendered as transparent background, and that's important for the compositing we do later. Alright, that's it with the render settings. So now as you can see, there are just a few trees. So let's just add a few more trees. Let's set this back to 20,000. And let's take a look at the background. We can make this a little bit brighter. Maybe add a slight blue color. Let's see how this looks like. This looks good to me, and now hit render and take care that you have all the important render layers enabled. And now let's render this. Alright, the rendering is done. It took 22 minutes. That's because my computer is not the fastest, and unfortunately Cycles can't handle a lot of alpha planes that good. And that's the reason that it also can take a while for rendering. Alright, now we have our render layers rendered. Now let's put it together in the compositor. So let's switch to compositing nodes, use nodes, and enable backdrop. Shift, Control, left click on the render layers adds the viewer node, and now we can see it in the background. And also we can zoom out a bit so that we can see the backdrop better. Now let's add a simple color alpha over node, duplicate the render layer, and down here choose the shadows. And now let's combine the two things. So now you can see we have the trees and the ground with the nice shadows. And that's basically the standard thing we need to do. So now let's take a look at the mist channel we have here. Now for the one render layer we have only the trees. You can see the trees are black and the ground is white. And back here we have this fog effect. And for the ground render layer we certainly have the same thing without the trees. And now we need to combine those two things. So let's add in a color mix node, mix both of them. And as blend type, we choose darken. And now you can see it looks perfect. Now let's take a simple mix RGB node, put the color in, set this as mix factor. And now you can see we have this nice fog effect. And with this color here, we can also change the color. Then quickly, let's add a color to the background. So I duplicate the alpha over node. Set this as lower color input, and now I simply Control C, Control V, copy the blue color, and now we have this nice forest with this nice fog effect. And yeah, as you can imagine, this is pretty handy and useful, and if you have set up everything once that I showed you in this video, then you can reuse this over and over again, so you don't need to set everything up again and again. Yeah, and now we have our nice forest with some fog effects. We also can open up the UV image editor, and if we connect the last alpha over node with the compositor node and change the layer to composite, we can see it here, and with F3 for example, you can save the image. If the whole settings I have done here are too complicated for you, you can download the project files. The link is in the video description. Now let's change the contrast a bit and use some curves to make this a little bit brighter. And then you have a nice forest. You can see some darker shadows here. This is because the normal map is quite strong. In this case, you can lower the strength of the normal map. But yeah, in general, we created this forest pretty quick. And as you can see here, it only uses 300 megabytes of RAM. And I guess this is related to the big texture size I used for the trees. So if you lower the texture size, this will be even less. And then it's not important how much trees you are rendering. You can render up to 1 million or I guess even more. Yeah guys, that's it with this tutorial. Sorry that it was a little bit longer, but yeah, maybe you like long tutorials, maybe you tell me in the comments. Also, if you are creating awesome forest with this technique I've showed you, please go sure to tag me in your social media posts. All my social media links you find in the video description below. And I want to say that I've discovered this technique, but I'm pretty sure that this is somehow used in games or anything like this before, so I don't claim that I am the inventor of this technique. Yeah, and also please share this video. If you like what you've seen, share this video, tell your friends about it. And also I have a newsletter. If you sign up, you get my latest news to your inbox. Don't worry, I don't spam you. And also you get my Blender sculpting cheat sheet for free. If you like my work and want to have some extra tutorials and support me, then check out my Gumroad page. There you find some extra content. Also, if you want to improve your CG skills, then join our weekly CG challenge. There you have the chance to enter a competition and win very nice prizes. So check out weeklycgchallenge.com for more info. Yeah, that's it with this video, and I hope we see us in the next one. Goodbye.